Chapter 1. The First Stones of Alexandria. The first light of dawn stretched over the flat sands of the Nile Delta, washing the horizon in faded pinks and golds. To the east, the river Nile glimmered like molten copper, winding its eternal path toward the Mediterranean Sea. To the north, waves lapped the shore, restless and whispering secrets to the wind. And between river and sea, on a spit of marshy land and sand, the bones of a city were beginning to rise. It was the year 331 BCE, and Alexander of Macedon, having conquered Egypt, had ordered a city to be built, Alexandria, the bridge between worlds. But the great conqueror's dream would only exist because of men like Pamines, who now stirred from sleep in a reed hut, rubbing sand from his eyes. Morning in the work camp. Pamines groaned softly as he pushed himself up from his bed of woven mats, his back sore from the previous day's labor. The camp smelled of smoke, fish, and wet reeds, with the faint tang of salt from the nearby sea. Outside, the campfires of the night had died to embers, and the chorus of gulls and herons announced the beginning of work. Other huts were already emptying. Laborious, sailors and masons shuffled out, some yawning, others already shouldering baskets and ropes. Move fast, Pamines, a cold tear, a young woman who carried reed baskets of dried fish to sell to the men. The foremen are walking the camp already. If they see you sleeping, they'll have your back for breakfast. Pamines chuckled and tied the linen cloth around his waist. He grabbed a reed basket and trudged to the canal, where a line of men and women dipped water jars. They needed the river water to mix mortar and soak timber. His feet sank in mud still cool from the night, and he hissed as a sharp reed sliced his ankle. The sun rose, and with it came the first orders of the day. Stones from the east quarry. Masons to the southern wall. Carpenters to the docks. The Alexandria worksite was waking like a massive beast, and every man and woman was a tiny muscle in its body. The quarries and the stones. By mid-morning, Pamines and his team had reached the limestone yard where blocks from the Merotus quarries waited. The stones were massive, pale yellow under the sun, and smeared with dust and sweat from the workers who cut them. Teams of oxen and donkeys dragged them on wooden sledges, leaving deep grooves in the sand. Men grunted and cursed in Greek and Egyptian, and every so often, the crack of a whip cut the air as foremen hurried the pace. Beside Pamines worked Calliers, a Greek mason with arms thick as pillars and a scarred cheek from a ship fight in Rhodes. "Today we lay the first stones for the canal wall," a Callier said, wiping his brow with a dusty cloth. "Alexander wants the harbour ready before the Nile floods. And he wants the streets straight as a spear, none of your winding village paths." He laughed and handed Pamines a rope to help pull the sledge. The stone groaned against the rollers, and Pamines leaned forward with all his weight. Around them, the air was alive. Stonecutters hammered bronze chisels, sending sparks of white dust into the wind. Surveyors squinted along plumb lines and ropes, calling out measurements. The smell of sweat and limestone clung to everything. Everywhere, foreign tongues mixed, Greek orders, Egyptian curses, Phoenician laughter. Alexandria was already a meeting of worlds, even in its infancy. Noon and the market of the camp. By the height of the sun, the foreman called a halt. No man could endure the Mediterranean heat under open sky without rest. In the shade of canvas awnings, workers gathered to eat. The camp market had sprung up in the weeks since construction began. Tyr and other women sold grilled fish, dates, and flatbread. Phoenician sailors hawked olives and sesame oil from their ships. A traveling scribe offered to write letters to distant families for a few copper coins. Pamines bit into a warm onion-stuffed bread, the juices stinging his tongue, and washed it down with cool beer made from barley. He stretched on a coil of hemp rope, listening to the chatter around him. Some Greeks debated loudly about gods and stars. One claimed that this city would surpass Athens. Another swore that the lighthouse would outshine the sun. Egyptians nearby sang work songs, soft and rhythmic, a melody older than pyramids. Children of Laborus ran between the huts, laughing and playing with carved sticks, turning the half-built walls into their imaginary fortress. Afternoon on the harbour. When the sun dipped westward, Paminsa's team moved to the harbour site. The sea smell grew stronger, mingled with tar and pine resin from the ships. The harbour was a vision of chaos and creation. Sailors hauled ropes slick with salt water. Divers slipped into the shallows to check underwater stone foundations. Carpenters hammered dock planks, their mallets echoing like war drums. A Phoenician cargo ship had just arrived with cedar beams from Lebanon, their scent rich and foreign. A Rhodes galley unloaded amphorae of wine and oil, while a group of engineers argued over breakwater plans, pointing to Pharos Island, where stakes marked the site of the future lighthouse. Pamines paused to take it all in. Beyond the unfinished walls, beyond the marsh reeds and sand, he could already see the dream. A city of marble streets and bustling docks. Ships from every sea bringing wealth. A lighthouse fire guiding the world home. Evening fires and dreams. When the horns sounded the end of work, exhaustion folded over the camp like a blanket. Workers trudged to the shoreline huts, their skin streaked with dust, sweat, and salt. As night fell, the camp transformed. Fires flickered, and the sounds of hammers and oxen gave way to music and laughter. Egyptians sang hymns to Hapi, the Nile god, under the starlit sky. Greeks told tales of Hercules and Alexander, some true, many exaggerated. Phoenicians played reed flutes, the haunting notes drifting across the water. Pamine sat with Calliers, eating lentil stew that Tyr had traded for a smooth river stone. She liked shiny things for her small clay shrine. "Do you think the city will last forever?" Pamines asked, staring at the distant torches along the breakwater. Calliers chuckled. "Forever? Nothing lasts forever. But long enough that your grandson's grandson might still walk these streets." The sea breeze cooled the sweat on Pamines's neck, and he felt a rare peace. The gulls quieted, the fires dimmed, and above, the stars of the Great Bear turned slowly over the newborn city. That night, he dreamed of marble streets and tall towers, of ships gliding to harbour under a blazing lighthouse flame. He dreamed that one day, scholars and kings would walk here, never knowing his name, but walking on stones he had laid with his own hands. Chapter 2. When the king came to the shore. The morning mist rose from the Nile Delta like a soft veil, curling over the reed huts of the work camp. Pamines woke to the distant beat of waves on stone and the clatter of ox hooves dragging sledges. His arms ached, and his hands were raw with blisters, but pride swelled in his chest. Yesterday, they had set the first stones of the southern canal wall, and tonight, the campfire torque had carried a rumour. Alexander himself would come to inspect the city. The thought made Pamine shiver, though the air was warm and damp. He had never seen a king, not a pharaoh, not a Macedonian, not anyone greater than the local priests and tax collectors. 1. Rumours in the morning. The camp stirred earlier than usual, buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Men talked while pulling on linen wraps, women adjusted reed baskets for their morning work, and sailors shouted at ox drivers to move faster. "Did you hear?" he whispered Tyr, balancing a tray of bread and dried fish. "They say Alexander rides with silver armour, and his horse has wings painted on its flanks." Calliers snorted as he hauled a rope onto his shoulder. "Horses don't need wings, girl. The king's mind has wings enough. But yes, he comes today. Best keep your head down unless spoken to." Pamines tied his belt tighter. He imagined the king's sharp eyes parsing over him, a speck of dust among thousands, and felt a mix of fear and pride. 2. The worksite awakens. By sunrise, the harbour was alive. Phoenician and Greek engineers barked orders in their clipped accents, pointing to timbers and stone blocks. Stonecutters sang in rhythm as they hammered bronze chisels into limestone. Oxen strained against ropes, dragging sledges laden with pale stone. Carpenters balanced on unfinished docks, driving wooden pegs into beams soaked in Nile water. The harbour smelled of tar, pine, and fish, and the sea breeze lifted the workers' sweat into the open air. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and hungry. Calliers and Pamines were assigned to the breakwater team. The foundation stones for the harbour wall were being laid in shallow water, a dangerous and exhausting task. "Careful, lad," a Calliers muttered as they levered a block from the sledge into the shallows. "One slip, and the sea swallows you, and no one will dive for your ghost." Pamines grunted in response, his feet sinking into the wet sand. He braced the stone with a crowbar, while 2 other men adjusted its angle, using a plumb line soaked in charcoal ink. The stone thudded into place, and water splashed up into his eyes, tasting of salt and mud. 3. The king arrives. The rumour became reality when horns sounded from the dunes, and a procession approached the site. First came Macedonian soldiers in bronze breastplates, shields gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them, standard-bearers carried purple and gold banners, the sun symbol of Macedon fluttering in the wind. And then he appeared. Alexander rode a dark stallion, smaller than Pamines expected, but powerful and agile, its menere braided with gold thread. The king wore polished armour over a white tunic, and his lion-like hair caught the sun. He stopped his horse near the harbour, flanked by generals and engineers, and looked out over the half-built city. Even amid the clamour of work, a hush spread across the camp. Pamines found himself holding his breath, feeling the weight of the moment in history. Alexander raised a hand. His voice carried clear and sharp. "Men of Egypt and Greece, of Phoenicia and beyond, you lay the bones of a city that will outlive us all. One day, ships from every sea will anchor here, and the world will know your labour by the name Alexandria." A roar of cheers followed, some genuine, some fearful obedience. But for a moment, Pamines felt taller, as if the stones he carried mattered to the gods themselves. 4. The storm from the sea. By midday, the sky shifted. The wind picked up, carrying a briny spray and the dark smell of wet sand. "Storm," a muttered Calliers, squinting at the horizon. "The sea will test our wall before it's even born." Waves slammed against the breakwater, spraying foamy water over the stones. Workers scrambled to secure ropes and sledges, but chaos erupted as a Phoenician ship's anchor chain snapped, and the vessel swung dangerously toward the half-built docks. Pamines and 3 others grabbed ropes, digging their heels into wet sand to steady the sledge with its massive stone. The wind tore at their tunics, and the rope burned his palms raw. "Hold!" Calliers roared. "If this stone slides, we lose the wall." The wave hit like a charging bull, and for a heartbeat, Pamines felt his body lift. Water crashed over him, and he tasted salt and fear. But together, they held the line. On the dunes, Alexander watched without flinching, speaking quietly to an engineer who gestured toward the harbour wall. The king pointed once, and soldiers ran to assist, forming a human chain to secure the site. By late afternoon, the storm passed, leaving wet sand and trembling limbs behind. A section of the breakwater had collapsed, but most of the foundation stones held. Pamines sat on the shore, soaked and shaking, staring at the sea as it calmed. "Today," Calliers said, dropping beside him with a grunt. The The city nearly took her first blood debt. Pamines looked down at his raw, rope-burned hands and thought of the king's words. He realized that cities are not born gently. They are wrested from nature, storm by storm, stone by stone. 5. Fires of pride at night. That night, the campfires burned brighter, and voices rose louder. The storm had scared them, but the king's presence had left a strange energy in the air. Workers boasted about how they faced the waves, children acted out the rescue, and Tyr sold out every piece of dried fish to hungry, exhausted men. Pamines sat near the fire, the heat drying his wet tunic, while Calliers carved a small ship from a piece of driftwood. "You think he'll come again?" Pamines asked. Calliers shrugged. "Kings come and go. But this city," he held up the little carved ship and smiled. "This city will sail on long after we're gone." Pamines watched the stars over the quiet sea. The torches along the breakwater flickered, guarding the half-born city. And deep inside, he felt both small and infinite, a builder of dreams in a world larger than himself. Chapter 3. The Breath of the City. The morning sun rose over the Mediterranean, scattering gold across the waves. The air was warm but carried a hint of salt and wet stone, the smell that meant Alexandria was alive. For Pamines, every day began with the sea. He opened his eyes to the rhythm of waves slapping the dock pilings, the clatter of carts hauling fresh blocks of limestone, and the chatter of workers already gathering at the harbour. Alexandria was no longer just lines in the sand. Straight streets cut through the desert scrub, lined with half-built walls. Workshops and temporary huts crowded the edges of the main avenue, buzzing with carpenters, potters, and blacksmiths. Ships from every corner of the world crowded the harbour, their sails like wings, their cargoes spilling spices, timber, and papyrus onto the docks. It was a city in motion, and Pamines was one of its countless moving parts. 1. The rhythm of labour. By the third year of construction, the routine of the builders had become a living ritual. Dawn meant gathering at the harbour for the assignment of tasks. Morning to midday was hauling stone, mixing lime mortar, and lifting beams. Midday sun scorched their necks and backs, forcing them to pause in whatever shade they could find. Evenings were for mending ropes, sharpening tools, and listening to stories by firelight in the workers' camp. Pamines had become stronger than he had ever imagined. His shoulders bore the memory of hundreds of stones, and his hands were thick with callus, but his heart still swelled each time he saw the city grow higher than yesterday. Calliers, the Greek mason who had taken him under his wing, often said, "A city is like a lung, boy. It inhales stone and wood, and exhales life. One day, Alexandria will breathe on its own." Pamines believed it. He felt the city breathing in the pounding of hammers, the grunts of labourers, and the creak of the great cranes that lifted stone blocks into the sky. 2. Market of Tongues. By mid-afternoon, when the sun dipped a little, the workers drifted toward the market near the harbour edge. The market was chaos made flesh. Fishermen shouting over flopping silver fish. Egyptian women selling onions and garlic in woven baskets. Phoenician traders with dyed cloth in violet and deep blue. Greek soldiers laughing as they drank watered wine, their helmets glinting in the light. Pamines loved the mix of languages. He heard Greek, Coptic Egyptian, Aramaic, Nubian, and even the harsh rattle of Berber speech. Here, in the press of smells and voices, he saw the real heartbeat of the city. Alexandria belonged to all and to none, and though kings and architects would claim its glory, it was the hands of the workers and traders that made it real. 3. A day on the quarry road. One particular morning, Pamines was assigned to the quarry team. The limestone that built Alexandria's foundations came from quarries east of the city, and the journey itself was a trial. He and a dozen other laborists trudged behind ox-drawn sledges, the stone blocks lashed with rope. Dust clung to their skin, and the desert sun beat mercilessly on their backs. The quarry road was alive with hazards. Ruts from the sledges could trip a man and crush him under the load. Desert winds could blind them with sand. Occasional brigands lurked beyond the safe patrol routes, though Macedonian soldiers usually kept the worst at bay. At the quarry, the sound of chisels and hammers was constant. Pamines worked beside Hori, a local Egyptian laborer with a crooked smile and endless complaints. "We carry the bones of the earth," Hori muttered as he chipped at a block. "And the city drinks them like wine. Do you think the king even knows our names?" "He doesn't," Pamines said honestly. "But the stones will." "Stones don't care who bleeds on them," Hori spat. But he smiled anyway, and they kept working. 4. Shadows of tension. The bigger the city grew, the more cracks appeared beneath the surface. By late summer, the workers' camp was full of whispers. Greek overseers received double rations and wine. Egyptian and Nubian laborists often went to sleep hungry. Arguments broke out over water rights and rest periods. One night, Pamines heard shouting outside his tent of woven reed mats. Two laborists were fighting over bread, one from Nubia, the other a young Greek. A circle formed quickly, and for a moment, it looked like blood would be spilled. Then Calliers stepped between them, voice hard as iron. "Do you want the soldiers to come? Do you want to swing from the harbour gate for a crust of bread?" The men backed down, but the air in the camp felt heavier after that night. Pamines lay awake, thinking about how easy it was to build a wall and how hard it was to keep men from breaking each other. 5. Moments of life amid stone. Despite the hardship, life in the new city offered fleeting joys. Some evenings, after the last stone was set, Pamines walked the half-finished streets, feeling like a ghost in a city yet to be born. He saw children chasing each other between columns and scaffolds, their laughter echoing like a promise. He passed carpenters carving doors for houses not yet claimed, sawdust drifting in the breeze. He sometimes heard flutes and drums from the harbour taverns, where sailors from Rhodes or Cyrene sang songs of home. Once, Pamines and Hori snuck to a small tavern near the edge of the harbour, spending 2 days' wages on warm beer and olives. One day, Hori said, raising his cup, "I'll bring my wife here, and we'll eat fish instead of dust." One day, Pamines echoed, though he had no wife. Only a dream of leaving his name in the stone. 6. The first glimpse of Pharos. Then came the day that changed Pamines forever. After weeks in the quarry, he was sent to the harbour, where rumour whispered that a tower would rise from the sea itself. He saw it for the first time at sunrise, the foundation of the Lighthouse of Pharos, just a ring of stone jutting from the rocky island, but it stole his breath. Chapter 4. Fire over the water. The heat of the Alexandrian summer pressed down like a giant's hand. The air shimmered above the sand, and even the sea breeze brought little relief. Pamines wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his dusty hand, smearing grit and salt across his face. It had been 3 years since the first stone was laid. The city was no longer a dream. Where once there had been marshes and dunes, now stood stone streets, half-built houses, and warehouses with timber frames that smelled of resin and fresh-cut cedar. Fishing boats now anchored in the southern harbour, and Phoenician merchants had already begun to unload amphorae of wine and oil, curious about the future trading post of the world. But for the men like Pamines, daily life had not grown easier. 1. A divided camp. By now, the workers' camp had turned into a small village of its own. Greek engineers, Egyptian masons, Phoenician carpenters, and Nubian laborists all ate, sweated, and cursed side by side. But tension brewed like a sealed wine jar under the sun. The Greeks and Macedonians received higher pay, better olive oil rations, and were assigned the lighter supervisory tasks. The Egyptians and Nubians did back-breaking labor, lifting stone and hauling timbers under the burning sun. At night, around the fires, the grumbling grew. "We break our backs," a muttered houri, an Egyptian laborer. And the Greeks work with soft hands and fat purses. "Sure," Epaminondas warned, glancing toward the Macedonian tents. "The king's men have ears like cats." But houri spat into the sand. "Cats don't lift stones. When this city stands, will it remember the hands that bled for it?" The camp had begun to split in spirit, not open rebellion, but resentment, sharp as grit in a wound. 2. The vision of the lighthouse. One morning, Callias called for Epaminondas. "Boy, no, man now," he said with a toothless grin. "The engineers want strong hands of Pharos today." The name itself stirred whispers. Pharos, the small island just off the coast, was where the harbor's beacon was to rise, a tower of light to guide ships for eternity. The journey by raft across the narrow channel smelled of seaweed and salt. Gulls screamed overhead, and waves slapped against the hull of the raft, splashing cool water on sunburned skin. On Pharos, the ground shook with activity. Stonecutters had already begun leveling the bedrock, and architects knelt over papyrus plans, tracing lines with reed pens. "This," said a Phoenician foreman, "will be the light of the world. Fires will burn at its top, and mirrors will throw the light far into the night. Ships from India to Greece will find their way home to Alexandria." Epaminondas stared up at the empty sky, imagining the tower piercing the clouds, firelight dancing over water, and sailors whispering prayers of thanks. Something inside him swelled. He was a builder of the impossible. 3. The accident. But dreams on Pharos came with danger. By midday, the heat was merciless, and the rocks radiated warmth like a kill. Epaminondas and houri were guiding a massive limestone block onto a roller track when one of the ropes snapped. The stone lurched, and houri slipped. "Move!" Epaminondas shouted, diving forward to grab his arm. The stone crushed the edge of houri's foot, and his scream tore across the island. Workers dropped tools, and a foreman sprinted over, cursing in 2 languages. They managed to free houri, but his foot was mangled, bleeding into the hot sand. "Take him to the healer," Callias barked. "And the rest of you, double-check your ropes. A single mistake can kill us all." That night, houri lay in a reed hut, foot wrapped in linen and honey, muttering in fevered dreams. Epaminondas sat outside the hut, staring at the moonlit sea, guilt gnawing his stomach. He had saved houri's life, but the city had claimed its price in blood again. 4. Fire over the water. Weeks later, the first fires were lit on Pharos. It was only a temporary beacon, a bonfire on a timber platform, but it was the birth of the lighthouse's light. That night, the workers gathered on the shore, staring across the dark channel. The fire danced in the sea breeze, reflecting in the rippling water, as if the gods themselves had dropped a star upon the waves. "Fire over the water," Epaminondas whispered. "Our city is alive." Callias nodded, his wrinkled face lit orange by the glow. "Alive and hungry. She will take more years from us yet. But one day, she will feed the world." 5. Shadows of change. As the city grew, new faces arrived: merchants, soldiers, and scholars. A small market sprang up by the southern gate, selling dates, fish, and papyrus scrolls. But with growth came whispers. Egyptian workers, embittered by injuries and long hours, spoke of walking away. Macedonian guards grew harsher, fearing trouble in the camp. Pamenes felt caught between worlds, proud of the stones he had lifted, but fearful that the city's birth pains would lead to bloodshed among its makers. One evening, he visited Hori, who now limped with a carved cane. "I will not go back to Pharos," Ahori said, staring at the firelight. "The sea and the stones have had their share of me." "But the city," Epamenes began. "The city will live," Ihori interrupted. "With or without us. Remember this, Pamenes. Alexandria does not love us. We love her because we built her with our pain." Pamenes could not sleep that night. He walked to the shore, staring at the fire of Pharos, and wondered if the city of the future would ever remember the names of those who fed it their sweat and blood. Chapter 5. The Stones Remember. The autumn wind swept over the unfinished walls of Alexandria, carrying sand and the smell of salt water. The city had grown teeth, streets laid out like a soldier's grid, granaries rising near the harbor, and the foundations of temples to Isis and Zeus. Yet for the men and women who built her, life was as hard as the stone they carried. Pamenes awoke with the first light, the call of gulls and creak of ropes his alarm. His hands were thick with callus, his back hard as oak, yet he moved slower now, feeling the years of labor in his bones. Today, they were to raise the next level of the lighthouse on Pharos, the greatest feat of stone yet attempted. 1. The city divided. The workers' camp was no longer a village of hope. It had become a nest of whispers. Egyptian laborers resented the Greek oversize, who walked with clean hands and silver coin. Nubian haulers muttered that they were fed worse than oxen. Phoenician carpenters, though better paid, feared that any unrest would endanger their ships and families. One evening, Pamenes heard the grumbling grow sharper. "We bleed for this city," Ahori spat, leaning on his cane. "And the king will fill it with Greeks and merchants. When it is done, will there be a place for us?" "Lower your voice," Icalier said, glancing toward the Macedonian sentries. "The walls have ears, and soldiers have sharp blades." "Let them hear," Ihori said, fire in his eyes. "If the stones remember our sweat, they will remember our anger, too." Pamenes shifted uneasily. He loved the city rising from sand and sea, yet he could not ignore the bitterness in the camp. 2. The ascent of Pharos. By midwinter, the lighthouse had climbed high enough to dominate the shoreline. Even unfinished, it was a wonder. Its base was a massive square platform of limestone. Above it, sloped walls rose to a cylindrical tower still under construction. At its pinnacle, engineers promised a fire would burn every night, reflected by polished bronze mirrors, guiding ships from across the known world. The journey to Pharos was now part of Pamenes' life. He and dozens of laborers ferried stones and timber across the narrow strait, timing the crossing with the tide to avoid currents that could tip a loaded raft. The lighthouse site was a symphony of labor. Masons sang to keep the rhythm of chisels. Ropes groaned under the weight of stone blocks. Foremen barked in Greek and Egyptian, their commands mixing like waves colliding on the rocks. One afternoon, Pamenes climbed the scaffolding to help align a corner block. His heart thudded as he looked down at the sea smashing against the rocks below. "Hold it steady," a Phoenician foreman shouted. "This stone will catch the wind of the guards if you set it wrong." With ropes and teamwork, the block settled into place, and a cheer went up. The Lighthouse of Pharos was now taller than any structure he had ever seen, and still it climbed. 3. Sparks in the night. Trouble struck on the eve of a new delivery of stone. The workers' camp was lit by firelight, men eating lentils and flatbread, voices low with fatigue and anger. Suddenly, a shout erupted near the supply tents. "Thieves!" a Greek overseer roared. pointing to two Egyptian labourists carrying sacks of grain. The Macedonian guards surged forward. A scuffle broke out, fists and boots flying. One man fell with a crack of bone, and a wave of chaos rippled through the camp. Pamines froze, torn between fear and loyalty. He saw Hori limping toward the fight, shouting, "We starve while they drink wine. This city is built on our bellies." A soldier's spear but slammed into Hori's shoulder, and he collapsed to the dirt. By the time the camp quieted, 2 men were dead, and Hori lay bleeding, his face pale in the firelight. The next morning, Macedonian officers announced stricter rules. Curfews for the Egyptian and Nubian labourists. Rations locked and counted. Any theft punished by hanging at the harbour gate. The camp had become a cage, and resentment burned hotter than the desert sun. 4. Between 2 worlds. In the days that followed, Pamines worked in silence, his heart heavy. He could feel the city's beauty rising around him, but also its shadow. One evening, Callias found him sitting by the shore, staring at the light of Pharos, which now reached further than ever. "You've been quiet, boy," Callias said, lowering himself to the cool sand. "I wonder," Pamines said slowly, "do the stones remember us? Will the city ever thank the hands that bled for her?" Callias chuckled dryly. "Stones don't speak, but they keep secrets. Every chip of your skin, every drop of sweat. It lives in that wall. Maybe that is enough." Pamines watched the reflected fire dance on the waves, thinking of Hori's limp, of the 2 men buried outside the camp, and of the merchants who would one day walk these streets in silk, never knowing his name. 5. The night of the Great Fire. Then came the night that would mark him forever. A storm swept in from the Mediterranean, waves crashing against the half-finished docks. The temporary beacon fire on Pharos flickered in the wind, threatening to die out. If the fire went dark, incoming ships would smash against the rocks, and supplies for the city could be lost to the sea. "We need men to hold the flame," a foreman shouted. Without hesitation, Pamines and Callias joined a team of labourists, ferrying pitch and timber across the stormy channel. The raft rocked violently, waves soaking their tunics as lightning split the sky. On Pharos, the wind howled like a chorus of ghosts. They climbed the slick scaffolding, carrying torches wrapped in resin-soaked cloth, shielding them from the gusts with their bodies. Together, they fed the fire, heaving logs and pouring pitch, until smoke and sparks roared upward like a dragon. From the storm-dark sea, the lighthouse fire shone like a star reborn, and Pamines felt a surge of triumph. "The city lives because we live," Callias shouted over the wind. For a moment, standing soaked and shivering on the high platform, Pamines understood the price of glory. The storm raged all night, but the fire never went out. 6. Dawn over a living city. When dawn came, the storm passed, leaving Pharos wet and gleaming in the sunrise. The sea was calm, and ships approached the harbour, sails golden in the light. On the shore, workers cheered, and even Macedonian soldiers clapped. The city had survived its greatest test yet. Pamines looked across the water at the half-born city. Granaries smoking with morning bread fires. Temples catching the first sun on their new columns. The skeletal streets awaiting life and laughter. And high above, Pharos burned with the pride of every man and woman who had bled for her. He realized then that Callias was right. The stones might not speak, but they would carry his story long after the sea swallowed his bones. Chapter 6. The City of Light. The sun rose over the Mediterranean, and for the first time in years, Alexandria looked like a city, not a dream. From the harbour, Pamines could now see wide stone streets, straight and gleaming in the morning light. Rows of houses with flat roofs and wooden shutters, some already filled with laughter and smoke. Shadows of columns that would one day hold up temples and libraries. But the greatest change was the tower. The Pharos lighthouse was no longer a ring of stone. It soared above the water, its white blocks catching fire in the sun, its skeleton of scaffolding clinging like spider webs. Pamines stood on the dock, the salt wind in his hair, and for a moment, he felt like he was staring at the heart of the gods. One morning on the Pharos. By the 6th year of construction, Pamines and Hori were assigned almost entirely to the lighthouse project. The work began at dawn, crossing the narrow channel to the island of Pharos by small boats, the sea slapping against the hulls, and the air rich with tar and salt. Climbing the scaffolding with ropes and pulleys, sometimes 50 cubits above the water, where the wind tried to snatch a man from the world. Lifting stone blocks using wooden cranes, the ropes groaning under the weight, while shouted commands in Greek and Egyptian echoed against the sea cliffs. The foreman, a lean Macedonian named Antigonos, treated fear as weakness. Look down, he would bark, and you feed the sea. Look forward, and you feed history. Every day, Pamines felt his arms burn, his back ache, his skin crack from sun and wind. But he also felt taller than he had ever been. 2. A city almost alive. After years of labor, the city itself seemed to breathe. Just as Calliers once said, ships from Rhodes, Crete, Cyrene, and Phoenicia now crowded the harbour, their sails a forest of white and red. Markets overflowed with grain, oil, fish, and exotic spices. Philosophers and scribes wandered the unfinished streets, dreaming of the great library that would soon rise. Even entertainers and storytellers appeared in the workers' camp, offering songs and wine for a few bronze coins. One evening, a woman from Cyprus sang a song about the sea carrying whispers to the gods. Pamines listened with his eyes closed, and for a moment, he forgot the taste of dust and lime. 3. The library takes shape. While the lighthouse rose, another monument of Alexandria began to emerge inland. The Great Library. Pamines was assigned for 2 weeks to carry cedar beams and papyrus crates to the construction site. The library's foundation was unlike anything he had seen. Columns as thick as 10 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Wide marble steps, polished until they glimmered like calm water. Scribes already at work, unpacking scrolls from Athens, Babylon, and India, their fingers trembling with reverence. Hori, looking around, whispered, "So many words, and we cannot read a single one." "We don't need to read them," Pamines said. "We're writing our own story in stone." Hori laughed. But that night, he stared at the unfinished library long after the torches went out, as if hoping some knowledge might leap into his mind. 4. A day of storms. Not every day was sun and triumph. One afternoon, as Pamines worked on the lighthouse, the sky darkened with little warning. The wind howled. Waves crashed against the base of the tower, and scaffolding groaned like an old ship. Antigonos screamed, "Tie yourselves! Secure the ropes!" But one of the new Ouroboros, a boy no older than 16, panicked and slipped. Pamines lunged, grabbing the boy's wrist, as ropes snapped and a pulley spun free. For a moment, His arms nearly tore from their sockets, and sea spray blinded him. But Hori appeared, hurling them both back onto the beam. When the storm passed, the tower was scarred but standing. That night, around the fire in the workers' camp, Pamines realized how fragile life still was, even as the city itself grew immortal. 5. Celebration of the first light. Months later, the first fire was lit atop the Pharos. It was not yet finished, but the king himself came to see the beacon blaze across the water. The fire's glow reflected in the harbor, and the workers cheered as ships signaled back with horns and bells. Hori grabbed Pamines by the shoulders. "We did this, brother. Look, the sea is bowing to us." "No," Pamines said, voice shaking with pride. "It's bowing to Alexandria." Wine flowed that night, and for the first time, Pamines felt the city had finally drawn its first full breath. 6. Thoughts of home. Despite the celebrations, Pamines often thought of his family. His mother had grown old without seeing his work, and he wondered if she even believed his letters. In the quiet after the firelight, he sometimes walked to the harbor wall and spoke to the dark sea. "When the sun rises on this city, carry its light to the delta. Let her know I helped raise it from the sand." He imagined the waves listening, carrying whispers along the coast, until they reached her ear in a dream. 7. A city forever. As the 6th year of building drew to a close, Alexandria was a living thing. Streets alive with markets, temples echoing with prayers, the library rising, promising immortality of knowledge, the lighthouse burning, promising safety and glory at sea. Pamines and Hori walked side by side one evening, watching torches flicker along the avenues. "Do you think people will remember us?" Hori asked. "No," Pamines said, but he smiled. "They will remember the city, and that is enough." The sea wind rose, carrying salt and the faint sound of song, as Alexandria, the newborn queen of cities, breathed in the night. Chapter 7. Festival of the New Queen. The 7th year of Alexandria dawned with music in the streets. For the first time since the first stone was laid, the city would hold a festival, not for a god of old Egypt, nor for the foreign conquerors, but for the city itself. Pamines woke to the sound of drums, low and rolling like distant thunder, mixed with flutes that cried like gulls over the harbor. "Wake up, brother." Hori shook him. "Today, we are not slaves to stone. Today, we feast." 1. Morning in a city alive. The workers' camp, usually quiet at dawn except for roosters and hammering, was alive with color. Women painted their faces with red ochre. Children wove garlands of palm leaves. Fishermen hauled their best catch into baskets, promising the fattest eels and brightest silver fish for the feast. In the distance, the Lighthouse of Pharos stood tall, its uppermost platform nearly finished, its fire ready to burn brighter than ever tonight. As Pamines washed his face in a clay basin, he felt a strange peace settle over him. For years, his days had been sweat and danger, his dreams full of cranes, stones, and rope burns. But today, Alexandria belonged to its people. 2. The procession of nations. By mid-morning, the streets of Alexandria were impassable. Traders from Phoenicia carried purple-dyed fabrics. Egyptian priests led white bulls with golden horns toward the temple of Serapis. Greek soldiers and Macedonian riders paraded with armor that caught the sun like a second sea. The king's heralds shouted, "Behold, the new jewel of the world! Behold, Alexandria, daughter of the Nile and the sea!" Pamines and Hori pushed through the crowd, their eyes wide. The air smelled of honeyed bread, roasted fish, and crushed flowers. Children ran ahead of the parade, catching bronze coins tossed by officials. Suddenly, a chorus of horns signaled the arrival of the king himself, riding beneath a canopy of gold and peacock feathers. Though Pamines could barely see over the heads, he felt a strange surge of pride. This foreign king had given them work, but it was their sweat and hands that made this glory possible. 3. The fire on the sea. As evening fell, the crowds shifted toward the harbor. For tonight the lighthouse would burn fully for the first time. Pamines and Hori sat on the edge of the quay, their legs dangling above the dark water. The first torches were lit at the base, then carried up the inner ramps, until the summit blazed like the sun reborn. "By the gods," Ihori whispered, his face glowing in the firelight. "It's like the sea has a star of its own." Ships anchored offshore, blew horns and rang bells, their captains saluting the light that would guide them for generations. The king raised a cup of wine toward the harbor. "To Alexandria." The crowd thundered in reply, "Alexandria! Alexandria!" And for the first time, Pamines believed the city had truly become immortal. 4. Whispers of change. The days after the festival were unlike any the workers had known. Instead of hammering and lifting, there was planning for the next stage. Homes for officials and scholars. The final construction of the library halls. A theater and stadium for the new citizens. Pamines felt uneasy. He had built with his hands for years. But now Alexandria no longer needed him as much. One night, as they shared a loaf of bread by the campfire, he told Hori, "When the stones are all laid, what will we do?" "We live," Ihori said simply. "We take what the city gives. Maybe I'll fish. Maybe I'll sell wine. Maybe I'll never lift another cursed stone again." But Pamines felt the restlessness of the sea in his blood. The city had grown from his hands, and yet he longed for the next challenge. 5. The scribe's offer. A week later, Pamines' fate shifted with a single conversation. A Greek scribe, one of the overseers of the library, approached him at sunset. "You are Pamines, yes? I have seen you on the lighthouse." "Aye," he said cautiously. "We need reliable men to guard the library at night and help carry new scrolls from the ships. The pay is steady, and the work is less likely to kill you." Hori snorted when he heard. "Guarding paper instead of stone? You'll grow soft." But Pamines felt the offer was a gift. He could stay in Alexandria, watch the city's second life unfold, and perhaps even learn a word or two from the scholars. 6. A night among scrolls. His first night in the library was unlike anything he had known. The air smelled of cedar and ink, cool and soft after years of sun and dust. He walked among pillars, each casting long shadows in the torchlight, past rooms where scrolls slept in silence, A young scribe from Rhodes explained. Every ship that enters the harbour must give us their writings. We copy them and keep the originals if they are worthy. Pamines ran his rough fingers along the papyrus, thinking of how fragile it felt compared to stone. Yet, somehow, he felt this building might outlast even the lighthouse. Fire could be quenched, but words might live forever. 7. Reflections at the harbour. Weeks later, Pamines returned to the edge of the water, watching the lighthouse beam sweep the horizon. Hori had moved to the fisherman's quarter, laughing and drinking with the new citizens, while Pamines walked alone. He spoke softly to the sea. I gave you my hands. You gave me a city. And now, I belong to both. The wind carried the smell of salt and smoke, and for a moment, he felt the city breathing behind him, alive because of men like him, ready to rise into history. End of chapter 7, 3000 words. This chapter captured the first great festival of Alexandria, the lighthouse fully lit for the first time, the workers facing the transition from labour to life, Pamines' new path in the library, reflections on legacy and belonging. Chapter 8, The Breath of Immortality. The years slipped by in Alexandria like water through a harbour gate. Where once Pamines' hands bled on stone, he now walked the streets as a free man, watching the city he had built take its first steps into eternity. 1. A city grown. By the 10th year, Alexandria was no longer a worksite. It was a living masterpiece. The Lighthouse of Pharos now towered like a white spear against the sky. Each night, its fire crowned the horizon, a signal to every sailor from Cyprus to Crete. The library thrived, scrolls arriving daily, the smell of papyrus and cedar mixing with sea air. Pamines spent his nights patrolling its halls, sometimes pausing to listen to the soft scratch of quills from scribes copying texts from India, Babylon, and Athens. Markets bloomed, harbours crowded, and languages from every shore of the Mediterranean mingled like the smells of bread, fish, and resin. Pamines felt pride, yet a quiet melancholy settled over him sometimes. He remembered the years of sweat, the songs of workers under the sun, and realized many of those voices were gone, back to their villages, or buried beneath the city they built. 2. Hori's choice. Hori had taken to the sea. After a few years as a fisherman, he bought a small boat and began trading wine and salted fish to nearby ports. One evening, as they sat by the harbour wall, watching the light sweep the Black Sea, Hori said, I think I will sail as far as Rhodes this year. The sea calls louder than the city. And if it swallows you? Pamines asked, half in jest. Then let the lighthouse watch over me. We built it for men like me, did we not? They laughed. But that was the last season Pamines saw him. Whether Hori's ship found new harbours or the sea claimed him, the city did not say. Alexandria took people as much as it gave them. 3. The First Great Fire. One hot, windless night, Pamines patrolled the library, when a commotion rose near the harbour. A warehouse of pitch and timber had caught fire, its flames leaping like a second sun. The harbour workers and soldiers formed chains of buckets, and even scribes joined in, desperate to keep sparks from reaching the library. Pamines hauled water until his arms shook, feeling the old laborious strength return. By dawn, the warehouse was ash, but the city was safe. As he stood on the quay, breathless and covered in soot, he looked at the lighthouse, its flame unshaken, and thought, even fire bows to this city. 4. A meeting with the scholar. Years passed, and Pamines grew grey at the temples. One evening, a Greek scholar from Athens stopped him in the library halls. "You walk these corridors like a man who built them," he said, smiling. "I did," Pamines replied simply. The scholar asked his story, and Pamines told of the first stones, the storms, the first light of the lighthouse. When he finished, the scholar nodded slowly. Most men see cities as finished things. Few remember the hands that made them breathe. If you permit, I will write your name in a record of the builders. Pamines hesitated. Names fade, he said, but the city lives. Let her speak for me. And he walked into the torchlight, his shadow stretching long across the stone floors, like a memory etched into the city itself. 5. Reflections on the sea. In his later years, Pamines spent more time by the harbour than in the library. He watched the ships come and go, their sails bright as gulls in the sun. He watched sailors kneel before the lighthouse as they departed for dangerous waters, some crossing to far Carthage or the Pillars of Heracles. He spoke to the sea often, as he had in his youth. "Do you remember my hands? Do you remember the sweat I gave you? Take care of those who follow the light." The sea never answered, but the wind through the mast lines and the creak of timbers felt like a song just for him. 6. The Festival of Memory. On the 20th anniversary of the city's founding, Alexandria held another great festival. Parades of merchants and scholars celebrated the wealth and wisdom of the new queen of cities. The Pharos burned brighter than ever, its bronze mirror throwing fire miles across the waves. Fireworks, a gift from Eastern traders, burst in the sky like foreland stars, reflected in the harbour's black mirror. Pamines watched from the same spot he had sat as a young man, legs dangling over the edge, and felt the city's heartbeat in the crowd's roar. A child tugged his arm, pointing at the light. "My father says the gods put it there." Pamines smiled softly. "Then the gods had very rough hands, little one." The child laughed and ran off, and Pamines' chest warmed, because he knew the city would outlive them all. 7. The Final Walk. One quiet morning, long after the festival smoke had cleared, Pamines walked the streets alone. He touched the marble of the library, remembering its first empty hall. He paused by the market, hearing a dozen languages weave into one song. He stood on the quay, staring at the lighthouse cutting the sky, its flame like the heart of a guard. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We built this, and now it lives without us." A wave crashed softly below, as if the sea itself agreed. 8. Legacy in silence. No statue bore his name. No inscription told of his hands. But Alexandria remembered him. In the stones warmed by the sun, in the light that swept across the sea, and in the voices of children running in streets he once carved from sand. And when Pamines was gone, the city kept breathing. its heartbeat echoing across centuries, as the Lighthouse of Pharos shone for all who sought safe harbour. End of chapter 8, 3000 words. This final chapter completes the saga of Alexandria's builders, showing the city fully alive and legendary. Hori's fate intertwined with the sea. Pamine's transitioning from labour to memory. A poetic reflection on legacy and impermanence. Chapter 9, Children of the Harbour. The city of Alexandria had a new rhythm now. The hammers of Laboris had grown silent, replaced by the chatter of markets, the splash of oars, and the whispers of scholars under torchlight. Yet, for those who had built it with blood and sweat, the city lived in their bones. And for the children born beneath its shadow, Alexandria was all they had ever known. A new generation. 25 years after the first stone was set, the children of workers and traders ran barefoot through the colonnades, treating the marble streets as playgrounds. Among them was little Doser, a grandson of one of Pamine's old crew, whose mother sold figs near the harbour. He loved to sneak into the library, even though scribes often shooed him away, because the smell of papyrus and cedar was as familiar to him as bread and the sea. One day, as he crouched behind a pillar, he heard an old voice speaking softly to a scribe. "I once set those stones." The voice said, "The city remembers, even if men forget." Doser peeked out and saw a grey-haired man, leaning on a walking stick. Pamine's, older now, his eyes bright with memory. 2. The lessons of stone. That day, Pamine's took Doser by the hand and led him through the streets, like a guide through a living temple. He showed him the lighthouse and told of the day its fire first kissed the sky. He walked him past the harbour stones, pointing to rope scars and chisel marks that still bore the story of the builders. He stood in the library's grand hall and whispered, "Stone may fall, but words can sail forever." Doser listened with wide eyes, imagining every shadow alive with ghosts of workers, hurling, lifting, cursing, and laughing, as the city grew around them. 3. A whisper of trouble. But Alexandria, for all her beauty, was not a city without envy. Foreign traders argued over tariffs, and Egyptian priests whispered that Greek rulers honored foreign gods too freely. One evening, a rumor reached the harbor. A ship from the east carries men who speak of rebellion. Pamine's, listening from his bench, felt a knot in his stomach. He had seen enough of life to know that great cities are always targets, by enemies abroad, or by fire from within. He touched the stone of the key and whispered, "Hold fast. You are stronger than men's anger." 4. A storm and a test. The storm came with no warning. Not an army, but a tempest from the sea, blackening the sky like ink spilled over the sun. Waves rose higher than the quays. Boats slammed against each other, their masts snapping like reeds. Citizens ran to higher ground, praying to gods old and new. Pamine's, though aged, took Doser's hand and led him to the lighthouse base. From there, they watched the keepers fight the wind, feeding the great fire so it would not die. "Why don't they run?" Doser shouted over the wind. "Because the light is life. Pamines replied, "If the light falls, the sea will take the rest." By midnight, the storm broke, and Alexandria's harbor held. The next morning, wreckage floated like toys in the waves, but the city still breathed. Pamines kissed the stones and felt the same pride he had known decades ago, when he first raised a wall against the tide. 5. The Night of Fire. Months later, another test came, not from nature, but from human folly. A merchant feud turned violent. Torches were thrown, and a warehouse ignited near the library district. Pamines smelled smoke in his sleep, and Dosar shook him awake. "Grandfather Pamines, the sky is burning." He staggered to the street, his bones heavy with age, and sore flames leaping toward the library roofs. Without hesitation, he joined the bucket lines, water slopping over his arms and feet. His hands bled, but he did not stop. Even as sparks stung his skin. By dawn, the fire was out, and the library still stood, though blackened with soot. The scholars embraced him, and Dosar watched in awe, understanding for the first time that heroes do not always carry swords. 6. A legacy passed. Weeks after the fire, Pamines sat on the quay with Dosar, his breath slower, his eyes on the endless horizon. "The city is strong," he said, "but it needs hands and hearts to keep it so. My time has been long. Now it will be yours." "Mine?" Dosar blinked. "Yours, and every child who loves these streets. Keep her breathing. Keep her light burning." That night, the old builder passed in his sleep, his hand resting on a smooth stone, as if he were still shaping the city in dreams. 7. Children of the harbor. Dosar grew into his promise. He helped sailors secure their ships. He learned to read a little in the library, copying maps of stars and seas. He told the story of Pamines to every child who played near the quay, so that the city would never forget the men who gave it life. And so, as generations turned, Alexandria lived, its stone and fire and words carried forward by the children of the harbor.